Right, good evening, everybody. So I'm driving somebody else's laptop tonight, so bear with me when there's minor hiccups. Hopefully there'll only be minor hiccups. Welcome everybody to tonight's meeting. I'll explain a bit about sound in a moment. I'm going to try and introduce without using a microphone myself. Can you all hear me at the back? I'm getting some yes nods. Please do, if I forget and drop off a bit, please do tell me. I'll explain in a second why I'm not using the microphone. And welcome to everybody who's joined us on Zoom. I want to start by apologising for last meeting's sound problems. We think it was due to an issue between the microphone in the room, in the university room, and my laptop. We're investigating it as we speak. If there's any people out there who are into audio visual stuff and know about these things, we'd love to hear from you. We're not expecting or hoping we're not going to get any problems tonight because our speaker is remote on Zoom, so we've already tested it. Sounds good so far. But as usual, if anybody on Zoom has got a problem, please do put it in chat. Elaine is hosting again tonight, and should be able to help if we've got a problem at all. I should say, by the way, I'm on a laptop called Sue Charnley, but I'm really Sally Waring, for those, if there's anybody out there who doesn't know. Firstly, I'm going to start with a quick advert for particularly for non-members. We recently published our latest annual report, 2018, Birds of Berkshire. All our members are getting a free copy. Those of you who are here tonight should have already got theirs, but non-members can buy a copy for £7.50 plus postage and packing. And we also have two other publications you might be interested in if you're not a member, which is the Berkshire's Birdscapes, which was published last year, written by Renton, and also Where to Watch Birds in Berkshire, which is a good site, a good summary of the 20 best sites in Berkshire, and both those are available for £5 each. Okay, so let's move on to a few announcements about meetings. Our next meeting is, as usual, in 2 weeks' time on the 15th of February, which is by Ken Norris. It's our joint lecture with the university, I should say, and he's going to be speaking on endangered birds in Mauritius and how has 2 decades of science helped. So that's 2 weeks' time. I have 2 outdoor meetings that we're running that I want to mention. The next one is Monday, 6th of Feb, which is organised jointly with with NDOC. Bob Lyle will be taking people to Titchfield Haven. We'll be leading a walk there. And then on Thursday the 16th, which is the day after our next indoor meeting, our next walk is a midweek walk to the Jubilee River, which is going to be led by Brian Clues, not David Fuller, as it says in the programme. If you're interested in going on either of those walks, please do contact the leader well in advance so that they know to expect you. And I just want to mention some of the other meetings of some of the other local groups. If you want any information about where, contact details, come and see me in the break, or if you're on Zoom, put a note in chat and we'll make sure you get the information you need. But a quick run through of the local groups. RSPB local group, Wokingham and Bracknell, their next indoor meeting is on Thursday the 9th. So that's Thursday next week at 8 o'clock in Finch-Hampstead. And it's Andy Sands talking about the birds of Upper Teesdale. If anybody missed him when he came to talk to us recently, I highly recommend it because it was a really good talk and fabulous photos, absolutely wonderful. And their next field trip is on Sunday the 12th of February, when they'll be going to the RSPB Pulborough Brooks, Sussex for the day trip. And the other local group is, of course, RSPB Reading, and their next meeting is an alternative for people who aren't romantically inclined on Valentine's Day. On Thursday the 14th, they've got a talk by Pauline and Colin Butcher on UK islands, wildlife and volunteering. That's in Pangbourne. And their next field trip is the Sunday after that, that's the 19th, when they're going to Rye Meads, the RSPB Reserve in Hertfordshire. And the other group I'd just like to briefly mention is NDOC Their next indoor meeting is on the 16th of Feb, so the day after our next one, where they have a talk on India and the Andaman Islands from David and Nancy Massey, and that'll be in Greenham at 7:30. And their next outdoor trip is on the 12th of Feb, Sunday the 12th of Feb, where they've got a day trip to Blashford Lakes. So plenty there if you're interested in any of the talks or trips and so on. But if anybody wants any contact details, do come and have a quick word with me in the break or put something in chat and we'll give you the information. You should, all the members here should have had an email recently about the BTO Woodcock survey. We're still trying to drum up support. If there's anybody out there who'd like to be a woodcock surveyor, please do respond. And if there's any non-members on the call on the Zoom who would like to find out more, let me know. But it's sadly a bird that's declining and needs they did surveys before in 2003 and 2013, so this will be the next repeat to see what's been happening in the last 10 years. Right, one announcement I know of is from Jane. Oh, looks like Sue's got something to say as well. Okay, Jane first, then Sue.
Okay, another plug for the photographic competition, which is on March the 15th. 3 categories: portraits, flight of action, and birds in Berkshire, and you can enter up to 5 photographs in each of those categories. And the closing date for entries is the 3rd of March. That's a Friday. So all the details are on the website. You email your photographs to me. Thank you. I have 1 entry so far.
It's early yet, isn't it?
Hi everybody. Last year Richard Sajak made some wonderful bird boxes, which I think some of you here in the room and possibly at home there have purchased for their birds. I have got 2 left. Obviously the breeding season will be coming up in a couple of months or so, so if anybody would like one of the or even both of the bird boxes, you could always perhaps let Elaine know through chat if you're watching at home, or anybody here can come to me. So there are 2, and he was taking sort of voluntary donations, so maybe something like 15 to 20 pounds or more. They're beautifully made, very well made bird boxes. Okay, so if you like one, then please either leave a message in chat or come to me in the break. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Right, only one other thing then to cover before we start meeting properly. Recent bird sightings. Having a quick look at barked birds before I came out. I see some lucky people who've been seeing marsh harriers, one at Dorney Wetlands today, one at Lavels and Lake on Sunday. There've been a few pintails around at the main pit today. And there's also merlins being seen, one at Cowdown yesterday and one at Farley Hill on Monday. And it sounds like there was a cattle egret, but that apparently has moved on. My all-time favourite bird, so I should warn you, whenever I'm talking about recent sightings, if there's been a cattle egret, I'll be mentioning it. What about anybody else though? Anybody on Zoom been seeing anything, or anybody in the room got some sightings they'd like to share?
House sparrow in my garden.
That was Sue's just said she had a house sparrow in the garden. That can be a really good news if you and somebody at the back there.
Green actually towards the Thames.
Really? So that's a cattle egret and great egret. Towards Emma Green?
Yes.
Wow, flew towards the Thames.
Yes.
So I don't know if you all heard that on Zoom. A great egret from Emma Green towards the Thames on Saturday. That could have gone over my house and I didn't notice.
Elaine on Zoom says there were goose standers on Moor Green Lakes last Sunday.
Right, okay, if did I put that in the chat?
Yeah.
Okay, there's goose sanders on Moor Green Lakes on Sunday. Any other sightings? Did anybody get anything good in the garden for when doing the RSPB bird watch?
I got 16 field fares, but unfortunately there were 2 gardens down.
I wouldn't worry about that, Elaine. Elaine got 16 field fares. Go on, Anna.
I've got a male and female bullfinch.
Oh, and Anna got a male and female bullfinch.
I'm so lucky to be looking out the window at that for you.
Nice one. I was going to say I got 1 field fare, which is quite good, but after Elaine's 16, I don't think it's worth mentioning, to be honest.
Ringneck ducks are still turning up occasionally, more green.
Thank you, Rob. Did you all hear that in the room? Ringneck ducks? Good. That means the sound's working well. That's a good start, isn't it? I'm going to, okay, if there's nothing else, I'll move on now to the main point of the evening and set up the Zoom for Mark. So if you bear with me for just a few seconds, I hope a few seconds, while I get the Zoom screen into the right place, and then we should be ready to start. Okay, Mark, would you like to share your screen and we make sure that the slides are visible to everybody on Zoom and in the room?
Got them?
Good here. Let me just change the view. That looks good. You look all right on? Well, of course I can wear a mask. Okay, thank you. Let me introduce Dr. Mark Eaton, who is today presenting from Northumberland, hence why he's on Zoom rather than here. I'm quite jealous, I must admit. I had a very nice holiday birding up there last year and I'm really keen to go back. But he's not going to be talking about the area today. He's the Secretary of the Rare Breeding Birds Panel, and his expertise lies in developing the monitoring of and reporting on the status of birds both in the UK and internationally. Tonight he's going to tell us about the work of the panel and share some of its findings and show us how we can help its work. So I'll pass you over to Mark, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for giving me the chance to talk to you this evening. Before I start talking about rare breeding birds, I can't help myself. I used to be, I would work for the RSPB for many years, and one of my duties in years gone past was to analyse the data for the Big Garden Birdwatch. So I should tell you all very, very firmly that if there were some tempting field fairs in next door's garden, they're in next door's garden, and you shouldn't be counting them and put them in on your form. So behave yourselves. Because hopefully next door are doing the Big Garden Birdwatch, and they'll be reporting those 16 field fairs, whatever. So it's not my responsibility any longer, but I thought I would pass that on. Yes, so I'm going to talk from my position as secretary of the Rare Breeding Birds. That's the job sort of running the work of this organisation. But I'm also going to cast an eye back slightly to my previous role as principal conservation scientist at the RSPB and talk a little bit about other work that goes on monitoring rare breeding birds in the UK. And now I go to my first slide, a bit roll forward. Here's what you can expect from me this evening. I'm going to start by talking about the need for monitoring rare breeding birds, why this is worth doing, why it is valuable, the work that I and many others do in monitoring rare breeding birds. I'm hopefully, by doing this, I'm going to convince you that what I talk about in the rest of the talk is worthwhile. I'm then going to spend a little bit of time talking about these single species surveys run by the RSPB to monitor some of the UK's rare breeding birds. And I'm going to spend a bit longer talking about the work of the RBBP, the Rare Breeding Birds Panel. And finally, I'm going to sort of turn it round a little bit. The payoff for giving these sorts of talks is to talk briefly about Berkshire and the rare breeding birds you have, and how birdwatchers such as yourselves can help the work of the Rare Breeding Birds Panel, because what you'll learn is that we're an organisation that is dependent on the activities of birdwatchers throughout the UK, going out looking at rare breeding birds and reporting their sightings. So I'm going to sort of try and encourage you and hope you get enthused for the forthcoming spring, that you can then go out and help us with our work. So this first bit, why monitor, why this is worthwhile. And there are a number of reasons, a number of values to collecting data on rare breeding birds, whether it's through RSPB surveys, through BTO's work, or through the RBBP's work. One of the most important things is to enable us to know how all our species are doing, to set conservation priorities, because it is an obvious but rather sad fact of life that we don't have all the resources that we have to do the conservation that we would like to do. We can't conserve all species all the time, everywhere. And it's a very important part of conservation. Work is setting priorities, identifying what the most important things to do with the resources that are available. And one of the main ways of doing that is identifying the species which most need our help. In the UK, for birds, that's done through this process, Birds of Conservation Concern. And we're just recently, well, not so recent now, late 2021, published the 5th Birds of Conservation Concern Assessment. So these regular assessments. Back a few decades ago, this sort of process of identifying priority species started with this, a red data list for birds in Britain, and then moved on to this process of a standardised assessments, nowadays at periods of every 6 years, where all of the UK's regularly occurring species are assessed against some quantitative criteria to identify which species are most of greatest concern, by putting these species, all species, either on the red list of greatest concern, amber list of moderate concern, and green list of low concern. And I could give a whole talk. In fact, I do sometimes give a whole talk on this whole process, because this is something I used to do for the RSPB. But I won't. I'll skip to just showing you of the UK's rare breeding birds. These are the species which are on the red list. So you can see there's quite a list of species that are rare breeders, which are of greatest concern, our highest category of concern. The asterisks against 4 of those species there are the 4 species of rare breeders that moved on to the red list in that latest assessment in 2021. It's a sad fact that in each and every one of those 5 assessments, the red list has got longer than it was previously. It continues to grow, and we can see quite a number of our rare breeders. 1 or 2 of those are red listed not for reasons of their breeding population, must be said. So for example, goldeneye moved onto the red list at this latest assessment due to declines in the wintering population. So the wintering population of goldeneye in the UK is over halved in recent decades. Actually, the small and rare breeding population is doing quite well. Likewise, smew is only a very rare occurrence as a breeding bird. Occasional lingering birds attempting to breed in northern Scotland, for example. It's because of the decline in the wintering population. It's been red listed. But most of these are rare breeding birds listed because of concerns and declines in their breeding populations over recent years. It's data from the work of the RBBP, which allows us to track the populations of these species and thus red list them. So it's our monitoring that enables to identify them as priorities for conservation. It's not just the red list. Sadly, we have a list of species known as former breeders. So those that were once breeders and have ceased to do so. Normally, and in many circumstances, you might call these extinct. We're quite wary of using the word extinct when it comes for the birds, because they can move around quite easily and come back when you're talking about local or national extinction. So for other than great auk, which is firmly extinct, some of these birds could possibly return to breed in the UK. But here are birds that have bred during the last few decades and now ceased to breed in the UK. One addition, that's a term extinct, you can see there. One addition in the latest review was golden oriole. It's a species that in the you see through the 80s there was a population of 30, 40, sometimes nearly 50 pairs of golden orioles breeding in East Anglia, and that population has dwindled, fell quite rapidly through the 90s into the turn of the century, and the last known breeding pair of golden oriole in the UK was in 2009 at the RSPB's reserve at Lakenheath. Birds still turn up, males like this do still turn up some springs, most springs, and sing in places, but failed to find a mate and had a confirmed breeding record now for nearly 15 years. So has gone onto this list of former breeders. But these assessments aren't all bad news, and the panel's monitoring the trends that the red-winged bird panel produces has enabled species such as white-tailed eagle, red-wing and black redstart to move off the red list onto the amber list, so still not completely into the clear, but shown an improvement of status. So our monitoring enables us to see these recoveries. White-tailed eagle being a particularly great example of conservation work. So prioritisation, effort gone into the conservation of white-tailed eagle, the reintroduction programme in Western Scotland and then in Eastern Scotland in more recent years, and now a population approaching 150 pairs and increasing year on year. So some good news there. So that's one thing. that our monitoring can do is set the priorities, as well as looking at individual species and allowing us to assess them. Our reporting can also feed into looking at the wider picture about how our nature is doing more generally. So data on rare breeding birds are importantly used in what we call indicators, biodiversity indicators. So these measures of the wider state of birds. For example, this is the UK breeding bird indicator. It's one of the suite of indicators that the RSPB BTO produce for the government, for DEFRA, every year as a measure of the fortunes of UK's birds, and some of our rare breeding bird data is in that, and also feeds into bigger assessments. So the likes of this, and this is something else harking back to my RSPB days project I used to lead there, these periodic state of nature reports that pull in data from thousands of species of not just birds, but all wildlife, and compiling these big assessments, and we can see these bar charts on the right of the screen there, is looking at trends in hundreds of species in this case, and classifying them into those species which are decreasing, which are the blue tones at the bottom of the bars, and increasing, those green tones at the top. And we can see that we have this balance, as we see in all these assessments, unfortunately, in recent decades, we have this balance of more species decreasing than increasing. These bigger picture assessments showing us how biodiversity across all of the UK, and as by inference, the environment more widely, how that is doing. Here's another example, particularly pertinent to rare breeding birds. This is an indicator, again, an official government indicator, looking at the UK's priority species. So these are the species identified by UK government and devolved governments as conservation priorities. These are species that used to be on the Biodiversity Action Plan, an old way of prioritising species. They're birds of conservation concern and so forth, and they get the most conservation attention. And we can see this line, the blue line there in the graph, is the average trend of priority species in the UK over the last 4 decades, and we can see the decline in their numbers. It's quite a few of our rare breeders are on these priority lists, and quite a lot of our rare breeding bird panel data feeds into this to allow this assessment of, unfortunately, loss in these priority species. So our monitoring allows us to identify priorities, that allows us to say how nature is doing more widely. It also supports research, helps research into causes of decline and helping to find solutions to that decline. So part of the next step in discovering what species need your help is to work out how to help them, and the database that we hold informs research projects on such species, and also on wider pressures. And this is just an example of one of the wider pressures. One of the main subjects of research nowadays, you'll not be surprised to know, you already know, is of course the impact of climate change on our birds. This is a piece of work using rare breeding bird panel data on quail, looking at the distribution of quail in the UK it was added to the panel's list in the mid-80s, 1986. And you can see what this graph shows. These dots are the mean latitude of singing male reported to the quail, to the panel every year. And you can see, as shown by the trend line, that black line through there, the mean latitude of quail has got further north through time. And in fact, that slope is about equates to about 5 kilometres a year. So the average position of a singing quail in the UK has moved north at a rate of about 5 kilometres a year, showing the impact on the range of quail, through. This doesn't prove it, but we know that this is a response to climate change. The red dots, in case you're interested, the red dots on the graph show what we call quail years. Quail are, and I've got a graph later which will show this, are an eruptive species which have some years which are much larger numbers than others. They can be tenfold as many in one of these eruption years. And we can see that most of these red dots are above the line. They're higher than usual. So in these years where we have lots of quail arrive, they go further north on average than in a usual year. They push right up. Quail are getting quite a regular occurrence right up in northern Scotland When I was up in Shetland a couple of years ago, surveying Wimbrel, there were quail singing in the fields beside the Wimbrel, so they really are pushing north. So just one example of how we can use our data to look at these bigger patterns and inform research. And the other thing that the panel data can do is, I've got here, inform the conservation response. It can help conservation. It's a resource to help inform what we do to conserve our bird populations in a variety of ways. One example is identifying the most important places for our rare breeding birds and making sure they're protected. So the UK Special Protection Area Network, so these are sites which are designated. This came through under the Birds Directive, under EU legislation, but these are still protected areas within the UK. So our SPA network and our SSSI network have used rare breeding bird panel data to identify the places with particular concentrations of species, which are then designated and given a particular level of protection, additional management. So our data has enabled that, and our data enables the monitoring of these areas to ensure that they are being managed properly and they are maintaining the populations that they were designated for in the first place. Very important. This is quite an important element of bird conservation in the UK, and our data is pivotal for enabling this to happen. And then finally, just as a sort of to bring things round, as another reason this is good, if you set your priorities rightly and you do the research and you do the right conservation response, you hope to see species recovering as a consequence. And of course, our ongoing monitoring enables us to measure the effectiveness of conservation interventions. One nice example of that is, of course, red kite. And I like using red kite as well, because I don't know whether you saw when I waved this book before, the very first red list for the UK had a red kite on the front cover, because at the time of that book, it was no better example of a threatened species. Even the panel, the rare breeding bird panel, was formed in 1973. At that point, red kites were very close to extinction in the UK. There were probably less than 30 pairs, restricted to a few Welsh valleys. And you can see from the figure here, we saw the slow recovery, the protection of that population. And then we saw the much sharper increase resulting from reintroduction projects, initially not all that far from Berkshire and in Chilterns in Buckinghamshire, and the rapid increase as a consequence of that introduction and the later introductions in Scotland and elsewhere in England, and the continued recovery of the Welsh population. And although that graph goes a bit wonky at the end, it's nothing to be alarmed about, because of course red kite got to the point where the population expanded beyond the ability to monitor them every year. There were too many to count every year. And then just over 10 years ago now, we realized, well, it was no longer a rare bird, so the rare breeding bird panel stopped collecting data on it. And now indeed our monitoring of red kites comes through the BTO's breeding bird survey. It is a common and widespread species, so great conservation success that we've been able to monitor through panel's work. Okay, so hopefully I've told you that this is at least, got some value to it, and it's not just sort of hobby for interest. So I'm going to now talk more widely about how we do this and how this works. The first thing to say is that all I'll talk about today is really about partnership. So the work of the RBBP is supported by the RSPB and the JNCC as our main funders. JNCC acting on behalf of, they're the sort of umbrella body for governmental conservation in the UK, acting on behalf of the 4 country agencies, such as Natural England and NatureScot. BTO are also an important supporter of the RBBP, providing some funding. And all of these organisations, you can see here, WWT as well, work together in partnership on much of all of the monitoring that enables us to know how all of the UK's birds are going, not just the rare breeders. The other element of partnership and vital sort of partner in in the monitoring. I use this rather strange slide to illustrate. You'd be wondering why on earth I've got a photo of a football ground. This is the city grounds, the home of Nottingham Forest. I'm not particularly a Nottingham Forest fan or anything. I just use this because it sits about 19,000 people. So it's a useful way to illustrate when the last BTO Bird Atlas was conducted, that was from 2007 to 2011. They had about 19,000 people take part, contribute data to that massive exercise of mapping all of the UK's birds in the breeding season and the winter. So it gives you an idea of the scale of dedicated and knowledgeable and enthusiastic volunteers we have in the UK who are able to commit and contribute to a project like that. So that's really quite remarkable. And incredibly important, and enables us to do things, to do monitoring that we wouldn't possibly be able to do without this volunteer base. So anyway, you can fill a football stadium with the people who took part in that, and that gives you an idea of the number of people out there who can help other projects, such as I mentioned the BBS, and collecting data for the rare breeding bird panel. So that's really a crucial part of the partnership that does this monitoring in the UK. To set the scene of our rare breeding bird monitoring with other monitoring, I'll show you this graph. The vertical axis here going up the side is bird population side, breeding population of, if you can imagine, all of the UK's breeding birds. This goes from 1 at the bottom to the log scale, so one at the bottom to 10 million at the top and a little bit beyond. And then make a couple of examples. At the top of that, we would have wren. So that's the UK's commonest breeding bird. The latest estimate of the wren population is about 13 million pairs. So we've got that at the top of the scale, and at the bottom of the scale, the UK's rarest birds. So an example would be bluethroat. So that's a species that breeds every few years. There's probably been, I should know really, but probably about half a dozen breeding attempts in recent decades. This is a photo of the last time a pair in Northern Scotland in the Highlands, which raised young, the red spotted race of bluethroat. So our rarest birds. So the BBS I've mentioned, the Breeding Bird Survey, which maybe some of you take part in, is responsible for monitoring the commonest birds. So at the top of that scale covers about 117 species. It's a slowly increasing number as more people take part in the survey. So that's from wren down to species with populations of several thousand, about 5,000. Things like willow tit are still covered by the BBS. So it covers all those species and gives annual trends and allows us to track the fortunes of those species. Then we have these RSPB surveys, which I shall come on to talk about briefly, which covers these scarcer species. A bit of overlap with the BBS, but species with maybe a few hundred or a few thousand breeding pairs, which needs particular surveys. They're too scarce, they're too localized to be covered by the BBS, but they may be too common and too widespread to be well covered by the work of the RBBP. The RBBP then covers the really rare species. And on an average year, it reports on about 100 species, from bluethroats up to more common species with an upper threshold of 2,000 pairs. So that's how, amongst these different sources of coverage, we get good monitoring of nearly all of the UK's breeding birds. There's also some BTO surveys, things like tawny owls and house martins, chats, nightingales that they've done in recent years. Some species around that range you can see there. But through this fitting together and then special surveys such as the seabird monitoring, we have good coverage of our breeding bird populations. There are a few gaps. So things like Ida, for example, doesn't get treated as a seabird when we go out and count seabird colonies, is too sort of scattered to turn up on BBS plots, but isn't rare enough to be considered a rare breeding bird. So that falls through the gaps. Ptarmigan. Yeah, this is a difficult species to monitor. Ptarmigan is now on the UK's red list, Birds of Conservation Concern 5 list I showed before, using data from shooting. So game bags we use to red list ptarmigan because we really don't do enough counting of them. So there are some worrying gaps in our knowledge, but actually we are very well placed for knowing how our breeding birds are doing. So You'll have seen that acronym I put up on the slide just a minute ago, SCARABS. It's a horrible acronym. It is the Statutory Conservation Agencies and RSPB Annual Breeding Bird Scheme. We'll call it SCARABS, so I don't have to repeat that. Basically, this is a partnership, long-running partnership between the government agencies responsible for conservation in the UK. That's the 4 national agencies, such as Natural England, and the RSPB, in running periodic surveys of those species of conservation concern in that sort of scarce bracket, where we don't have good enough information on their populations from other sources, such as the BBS or the Rare Breeding Bird Panel. So this is running a program of these. So each species gets a periodic survey, either 6 or 12 years, ideally. And we can see a list here of some of the species, most of the species on this SCARABS list, and hopefully you can see that and read that on your screen. So these are largely scarce species, not our greatest rarities. Some of these are populations of hundreds, some are populations of sort of low thousands. So these get surveys at intervals of a decade or so. Unfortunately, in recent years, governmental funding for conservation work and for monitoring and research hasn't been all that it could be, putting it mildly. And so quite a few of these species have fallen off the desired cycle of surveys. So for example, Merlin was last surveyed in 2007. We have quite a lot of concerning information about how the Merlin population is doing, but we haven't been able to find the resources to do a proper survey since then. So the 12 years came up in 2019, and still struggling to find the resources to do a survey. Some of these are quite expensive things to do, although volunteers can be used and do help with many of these surveys. Things like Merlin require field workers to go into remote places where people don't live and there aren't any volunteers. So yeah, it's tricky to do. But so these species get these periodic surveys that give us updates. Just one example of this, one of the species that received the most attention. So I mentioned 6 or 12-year cycles. That 6-year cycle is reserved for species of the greatest concern. These are not necessarily cheap things to do, these surveys. So it's only the species that we're really concerned about that get those at the moment. That is capercaillie and hen harrier, the 2 species that are on this shorter cycle. Capercaillie surveys, I've been involved in quite a number, run quite a number of my time at the RSPB. They're very hard work. Capercaillie are a very difficult bird to find. They're the only one, although it is a survey of the breeding population. Capercaillie are resident. I can imagine something like that migrating. They are surveyed. They're the only one that's surveyed in the winter for a couple of reasons. One, capercaillie are easier to find in the winter, and 2, there's huge concerns about the impact of disturbance on capercaillie during the breeding season. So by surveying in the winter, we're reducing any impact on the breeding success of the species by not disturbing them during the sensitive breeding period. Capercaillie survey involves walking transects, 2-kilometre transects through thousands of randomly selected plots of woodland through the capercaillie range. These transects are triangular. The field workers can walk 2 kilometres by doing 3 legs of 666 meters each. So they end up at the same point where they started from. It's a sort of economy. It saves you having to walk 2 kilometres in one direction and having to walk all the way back. So you can do more plots by saving time that way. The map here shows the distribution of capercaillie, the reducing distribution of capercaillie. The different shadings of these plots of woodland indicate the likelihood of capercaillie still remaining in them based on how long ago records were received. And you can see these dark grey areas within Strathbay are really the core area of remaining capercaillie. In the winter of 21-22, over 700 of these transects were walked in these grey patches. Capercaillie searched for, and through some clever statistics based on the encounters of capercaillie on those transaction estimates reduced, which is rather sadly down to 542 individual capercaillie in the UK. So that's that bar on the end there, and you can see nearly a halving of numbers since the previous survey. In fact, a steady decline since these surveys started at the beginning or early 1990s, and there were believed to be about 2,000 individuals. By way of putting that into context, although there weren't surveys, a couple of decades before that, in the 1970s, the estimate was about 20,000 individuals. So there was an increase of about 90% before these surveys even began. So things looking pretty bleak for capercaillie at the moment, it has to be said. Other recent surveys, turtle dove. That's a species, again, this is a depressing bit of the talk, sorry. Our fastest decreasing species in the UK. So a decline of about, well, over 98% since the 1970s. The population now, based on the survey in 21, with a lot of volunteer involvement because of the distribution of, rather than being in sort of remote Scottish pine woods, like capercaillie, of course, turtle dove are mainly in the south and east of England. So this was an RSPB-led volunteer-based survey, produced an estimate of just over 2,000 pairs. And willow tit. So willow tit has been treated as a rare breeding bird. Until recently, it was covered by the panel until 2020. But a survey run by the RSPB 2019, 2020, 2021, very affected by COVID, unfortunately, produced an estimate of 5,500 pairs. So there are more willow tits out there than we believe, mainly in northern England. So that's partly good news, but doesn't change the fact that turtle dove are our fastest declining breeding species. Willow tit is our fastest declining resident breeding species, with a decline in excess of 95% since 1970. So still not doing well, but there are a few more out there than we believed. So just another example of these scarabs surveys and the monitoring they deliver. Right, so I've talked for ages and not talked about the RBBP, so that's what I shall do now for a little while, and then I believe we'll have a break. I can get a breath and a drink of water, and you can do likewise. So the RBBP has been going for 50 years, and please remind me before I go to mention the fact that we will be celebrating that this year, and we'll have some activities I want to promote to you before I go. You can see it formed in late 72, and in fact the first meeting of the RBBP was in the spring 1973, and it has collected data on our rarest breeding birds since 1973. It's an independent body, so it's funded, supported by the RSPB government with some support from the BTO, but it sits independently from them. And it is basically a panel of experts. At the moment, 9 of us. The volunteers, we have representatives from those supporting organisations, but they are volunteer experts. And those experts direct the work of a professional secretary who does the work of the panel, which is now me. I have been on the panel for about 13 or 14 years now. I was chair for many years, but took the opportunity 2 years ago to move to the position of being secretary. So I run the work of the panel. So what the panel does, it collates data on rare breeding birds in the UK. So we're not responsible. We don't go out and collect data. Unfortunately, my job doesn't involve roaming the UK during the breeding season, looking for rare breeding birds and recording them. Collate and encourage the reporting of data from other people. So we collect this data, we encourage others to get out there, such as I will be doing by the end of this talk. We maintain a secure archive, so we have 50 years worth of data on rare breeding birds, hundreds of thousands of records kept very securely. We're very pleased to say that in 50 years of activity, there has never been an accidental or inappropriate release of any of the data we hold. Because of course, there are sensitivities about the whereabouts, the information on rare breeding birds for obvious reasons. We produce annual reports. We'll talk about these. We produce an annual report published in the journal British Birds every year, and we maintain a website, you can see there. And if there's anything I don't cover this evening, or there's anything that wasn't clear to you, or you doze off halfway through and miss a bit, you can go along to our website, and there's a range of information, such as all our old reports going back to 1973, stuff on how to help our work, stuff about rare breeding birds. So please do have a look at that. So what's a rare breeding bird? Well, I sort of gave you an idea of that graph I showed earlier. We define rare breeding birds as those with populations of less than 2,000 pairs in the UK. So actually, you might, and I think some people are sometimes surprised by that, that's slightly more than rare. Some of those species you would maybe call scarce rather than rare. But anyway, it's our rules. That's how we define it. So that's what we work on. What species with less than 2,000 pairs, and there's about 75 to 80 species in that bracket. There's actually an even a longer list of species which aren't really breeding species, but maybe at some point in the future, species that turn up and show breeding behavior, make breeding attempts, but never actually succeed, never get as far as breeding. We include those species. I mean, in the past, that would have been the likes of little egret, for example, was a potential breeding species. So we collected data on that back then, and that means we have the information about how that colonization, which we saw subsequently, happened. We also cover rare non-native breeding species. So the bar for that is slightly higher. So these are only to find a species with less than 300 breeding pairs. We collect information on those rare non-natives. It is a valuable thing to do. I mean, non-native species can be a serious conservation issue, because it can have serious conservation impacts. And so it is a valuable thing to do as conservationists, to keep a watching eye and know what is happening with species which may be increasing from introduced sources in the UK. So just some examples, I just mentioned this one, some examples of these species. We tend to bracket our birds into the sort of classes. So our less scarce breeder class is those with between 1,000 and 2,000 pairs in the UK. An example being little egret, which is about in the middle of that now, about 1,500 pairs reported most years, steadily increasing and very slowly increasing nowadays, but expanding north. 2020 saw the first breeding in Scotland, for example. Another example, shoveler. Shoveler was added to the panel's list about 12 years ago, when we realised actually it may be a scarce species, and that's proven to be true. We get about 1,600 pairs reported every year. We have to work quite hard to encourage reporting of some species such as shoveler, because people don't realise that they're scarce, particularly some of the ducks, which are quite widespread and common, particularly in the winter season. Bird watchers don't necessarily click that when they see them in the breeding season. This is a noteworthy record worth reporting. But the shoveler is one of those species. Pochard another. This is coming down into our scarce breeder categories. That's between 300 and 1,000 pairs. Sometimes we miss records of pochard because bird watchers see them in the winter as a commoner species, although of course the wintering population has declined in the UK quite steeply. In fact, it's red listed on account of declines in the wintering population. The breeding population of pochard in the UK has conversely increased, but it is a scarce breeder. There's about 700 pairs, 600 or 700 pairs reported most years. Another example, I think most bird watchers would click as a rare breeding bird panel species, marsh harrier. Population slowly increasing, around 500 pairs nowadays, so that firmly within that scarce breeding category. Moving down, we get into species more sort of, I think most bird watchers would consider classically rare species. So black-throated diver, this is another species which hasn't been surveyed for quite a long time, and data reported to the rare breeding bird panel is not sufficient for us to monitor it particularly well. This is one of the reasons this scarabs programme exists. Although this is a species for which the rare breeding bird panel collects data, because of the remote nature of their breeding distribution, we don't get good coverage of their population annually. So it needs these periodic surveys. There hasn't been a black-throated diver survey since 2006, so we're not quite sure how they're doing. although at that point the population was increasing, about 210 pairs in the UK, so firmly within that rare breeder category. A bit lower down on that, a species I showed the name earlier, black redstart, has moved off the red list onto amber at the last review of birds of conservation concern, so doing quite well, but still only about 60 pairs of black redstart in the UK most years, although slowly increasing. Then we get down to the very rare breeders, the really exciting things, the things that would make anyone's day to find as a breeding bird. So marsh warblers, a very variable species in terms of numbers reported, mainly due to nowadays there used to be a regular breeding population in the West Midlands, Hereford and Worcester, small numbers but steady population, but that disappeared by the end of the 1970s. Really, they've gone extinct there. Our breeding population nowadays is generally scattered up and down the east coast, sometimes breeds as far north as Shetland. There's been breeding pairs near me in Northumberland in recent years. The numbers that occur from year to year are very much dependent on the weather during the migration period. We don't have any sort of population of returning birds, but if we get easterly winds in late May, early June, there are late migrant marsh warblers, we tend to get larger numbers turning up, often just of low males holding territories, singing but not attracting a mate. But most years there's a few pairs will turn up, a few males which will be successful, but it's very dependent on that weather during the migration period, rather than anything that we can do in the UK to help the population. And then an example of a species which really is, we get very few pairs of, redback shrike. It's a species which has hovered close to extinction for a great number of years, and I'll show a graph on their numbers later. But most years there is a pair. This is a offspring of a pair that bred in Shetland a few years ago. Most years there is a pair somewhere in the UK, so just hanging on as a breeding bird. And then we get to these occasional breeders, these extremely rare things, these things that may never breed at all, but try from time to time. And there was a period in the 80s and 90s where it looked like common rosefinch, scarlet rosefinch as it was called back then for obvious reasons, was colonising the UK, increasing number of pairs turning up, moving as the range expanded westward across Europe. That range then shrank back in subsequent years, and we haven't had a breeding pair of common rosefinch for many, many years. We still get in many years birds turning up and singing, trying to establish territories, males trying to attract a mate. And then we have species which do occasionally manage to breed, and of course I'm sure you'll have heard of the news last year when bee-eaters bred on the Norfolk coast. And that's, I think, now the 7th time since the 1950s this has happened, and this is happening with increasing regularity in the last couple of decades. Talked about quail range shifting earlier. Well, there's another example, climate change and bird distribution shifting. As bee-eaters are shifting north through Europe, we're increasingly getting records of bee-eaters turning up and trying to breed in the UK. So by collecting data on species such as this, we may be monitoring the arrival of what may in future decades become a regular breeder in the UK. And as I mentioned, and it is a struggle to get good data on the non-native species that are often overlooked by bird watchers, disregarded as sort of consequential, not proper birds, so not reported, but we do try and collect data on breeding populations of rare non-natives such as golden pheasant and more but increasing population of bar-headed geese. So you try and encourage that. And in fact, we don't report on non-native species with the same regularity. We have a small appendix in our annual report with records, but then we produce periodic reports on non-natives. And I'm just at the moment starting to work on the report on non-native breeders, which will be published later this year, summarising 6 years worth of data on these species. It's really quite a struggle for some of these birds that we know are in the country, are breeding, in some places might be quite widespread. Black swans, muscovy ducks, peafowl, but we receive very few records of. So, as I mentioned before, the RBBP doesn't go out and collect data itself. We don't have our own sort of field team. We collate data, and we rely on others to submit data to us. So a number of main resources, sources of this data. So conservationists, those professionals working in and around rare breeding birds and collecting data on them, running reserves that may have these species breeding on them, running conservation projects targeting these rare breeding birds. Scientists, they've got their specialist amateurs, so bird ringers, for example, those who work in raptor study groups, spending many hours every year working at monitoring birds of prey. But more important than any of those are bird watchers, and about 70% of the data that the RBBP receives annually comes from bird watchers going out, doing their bird watching in the spring and summer, and collecting data. So there was just some examples. So at one end we have people in either amateurs or specialist amateurs or professionals working on research projects, radio tagging white-tailed eagles. We can see here going to nests, monitoring nests of eagles, just through to bird watchers switching. But bird watchers going around and observing shovelers or finding common rose finches or whatever in the breeding season. And here's sort of showing the flows, and the most important element of this is bird watchers submitting data to their county bird recorder. So the UK is very lucky, really. We have this fantastic network of every county has its designated bird recorder, and it is one responsibility of each bird recorder is to collate data on rare breeding birds on an annual basis and make a submission to the panel. So by the end of November every year, to send me a file with details of rare breeding birds in their county from the previous year. So it's Berkshire, Mark Walford, collecting that data and sending that in, and allowing me to compile that with other sources. So we get data submitted by the RSPB from their reserves monitoring. We get the relevant ringing data from the BTO, the nest recording from the BTO, where that concerns rare breeding birds. We get these data submitted to government bodies on data done with Schedule 1 licenses. So most rare breeding birds in the UK are on Schedule 1 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, so you need a license to do any work that involves disturbing them during the breeding season. So we get the data that returned to the licensing agencies on the work that went on. So we get all this information flowing into me, which allows us to maintain the database and to produce reports. And I waved at you before, but this is where it all sort of gets distilled down to our annual report. There's a bit of a time lag. These flows of data, allowing people to compile data and send it in to me, and then the work I have to do to analyse that and to produce a report means that we're just over 2 years behind. So our report for 2020 came out in late 2022, for example. So I'm now working on 2021 for publication later this year. We show all our results and update how all these breeding species are doing in our annual reports. And this, I think, will be a good point to pause, to give you an opportunity for a break and for me to lubricate my throat. And then when we come back, I shall sort of open the pages of this report and show you some of the results and talk about how some of our rare breeding birds are doing.
I hope you enjoy the second half. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So yeah, I've given you a lot of background. Hopefully I've convinced you this is all worth doing, and I've talked about how we do things. So I'm just going to spend a little while now talking about some of the findings, some of the results, some of how our rare breeding birds doing, just a selection of species to talk about. For some reason the slides don't want to, oh, there we are, up too far. Now, one of the things that's quite noticeable, despite the fact I sort of had some gloomy things to say so far. I showed graphs earlier showing how on balance the UK is losing more wildlife, it's losing our nature. But actually when we looked at our rarest bird species, which in many cases are the recipients of conservation attention. They've been red listed by Birds of Conservation Concern assessments in previous years, and conservation organisations such as the RSPB have been working on them to help them. So we see quite a number of these species with healthy trends. So there's quite a lot of good news. So one example being cranes. So common crane returned to the UK as a breeding species in 1981 with the first breeding pair in the Norfolk Broads, and we can see here for the best part of 2 decades they remained an extremely rare species, restricted to the Broads and with very little breeding success. So poor productivity from the 1 or 2 pairs that were in the Broads, very carefully guarded there, but really very little expansion in the population. But we got to the turn of the century really, and we've seen a steady increase in the population in the UK since then. Largely driven, research has shown, largely driven by new birds arriving from Europe. And in fact, there's been a large recovery of the crane breeding population right across Europe. It allowed the range to expand westward back into previous breeding areas right across Europe. And it's more birds turning up from Europe, joining those birds in the Norfolk Broads, building the population there, and a gradual spread from there. And this blue line going up, there are now breeding cranes as far north as northeast Scotland, and doing very well. The sort of amber yellow line there is the Great Crane Project, so birds from the reintroduction project, which started just over 10 years ago on the Somerset levels. And after a couple of years of birds establishing there, began to breed, and that population has increased quite markedly as well. So we've seen an increase in both populations. In fact, now we have pairs there've been pairs in Oxfordshire and pairs in Gwent in recent years, which have involved birds from both populations. So birds from the sort of naturally occurring population spreading from the east, and birds coming from the Great Crane Project. So great conservation success there. We're also seeing increases in birds, and I've already mentioned quail, I mentioned bee-eater before. We're seeing increasing numbers of birds in response to climate change. So although we know that in the long term climate change is going to be one of the greatest threats to biodiversity globally, and it is a threat to species such as capercaillie, in the north of the UK, we are seeing increasing numbers of certain species in the UK in response to climate change. Black-winged stilt being one. They're now regularly breeding. Every year we are seeing breeding attempts from black-winged stilt in the UK. Quite often not successfully. Unfortunately, black-winged stilts tend to get their chicks predated or their nests trampled by cattle, which are used to manage the wetland reserves they like. So I think of the last 23 breeding attempts in the UK, only 7 have been successful, but this doesn't deter birds from turning up in increasing numbers. I think it's now 7 or 8 years in a row where there have been breeding attempts of a black-winged stilt in the UK, somewhere in southern England every year. And here's just an example of this, like common crane and many other species. The trends that we're seeing in the UK reflect what's happening across the UK more widely. This is a map from the European Breeding Bird Atlas 2, so the second exercise of mapping the distribution of the UK's breeding birds, the first atlas being in the mid-80s, or collecting data in the mid-80s. The blue squares you can see on this map, these are 50 by 50 kilometre squares. The blue squares are squares where black-winged stilts were newly arrived in that second atlas. They weren't in the first atlas, they were in the second. The rather few number of sort of burnt orange squares, if you like, are squares where they were in the first and not in the second, so they disappeared. And the grey squares were where they were in both. And basically you can see a lot of blue on this map, and you can see blue moving into the north of the range as the species has moved north, and you can also see blue through the middle of continental Europe, where black-winged stilts have moved away from the coast and started colonising inland Europe. So we can see this change in distribution, and there are many species which are showing similar sort of patterns of change, which are being reflected. At the moment, they're rare breeders in the UK and are on the very edge of the range, but you can see trends that we've got in the UK reflecting these wider patterns. I show this map to illustrate this point about black-winged stilts, but I also, I confess, show this just to sort of advertise this fantastic book to you. So the European Breeding Bird Atlas 2 is a massive tome which covers all of the Europe's breeding birds, so over 550 species, with fantastic maps of change and of distribution, of abundance, as well as just the distribution. It's wonderfully illustrated. It's got fantastic text. It is really worth looking into. But I have to add a caveat to me promoting this. This is produced by the European Bird Census Council. That's a pan-European organisation for the monitoring of birds across Europe. I am the chair of the European Bird Census Council. So when I tell you that you should go out and buy this book, I'm not exactly a sort of independent observer, but I can't recommend it enough. Moving on, another species that's showing a rapid increase in the UK related to climate change, but also to conservation action. And sometimes the lines between this are blurred. We think that particularly these large wading birds turning up in the UK in increasing numbers are a response of climate change. But in many cases, the populations are increasing across Europe due to conservation action, much like the recovery of cranes. Great white egrets as well, for example, they're not expanding north, they're expanding from the east of Europe, thanks to better conservation due to new European legislation, the Wild Birds Directive, for example. We can see here the rapid increase in spoonbill numbers, largely through the establishment of a large, what has turned into quite a substantial colony at Holcombe in North Norfolk. You'll notice that in most of our reporting and most of the work the panel does, we don't talk about places. You don't tend to give sites of rare breeding birds out. But in some cases where there's well-known and well-protected colonies on RSPB reserves or on Holcombe Estate in this case, we do talk about them. But as well as the birds on Holcombe, spoonbills are turning up and establishing on an increasing number of sites, quite scattered around. They've bred as far north as Orkney now, and we can see this increasing trend and expect that to go on increasing soon. And some of the new wetland sites that are highly suitable for, such as the RSPB's new reserve at Wallasey in Essex, once spoonbills established there, which I'm sure they will do soon, you might see some quite stratospheric increases in populations. Here's one which is slightly more unexpected. So we have this pattern of birds increasing in response to conservation action, reintroductions, increasing due to colonization and recovery from Europe and driven by climate change. Red-necked phalarope is a species on the very opposite of that, really. It's a species of very northern Britain, for which it's been quite hard, although sites are managed to the best of our ability to keep them in good condition for red-necked phalarope. The species is quite hard to target conservation at, and the population has often wavered around between 20 to 30, sometimes 40 pairs in the UK. And it's a species that is likely, or you're predicted, to suffer from the impacts of climate change. And we're seeing widespread declines across Scandinavia, and retraction of the breeding range of red-necked phalarope in Scandinavia, probably in response to climate change, which makes this graph really quite puzzling. Because red-necked phalaropes have undergone quite a very sharp, as you can see, the blue line there is the sort of maximum pairs reported annually. The dotted green line is the running mean through that, so a rolling average. And we can see a rapid upturn in the numbers of red-necked phalaropes breeding in the UK, in Scotland. The red bars are the number of sites, and we can see that increasing as well. So it's not just a few sites with red-necked phalaropes doing very well. The distribution has expanded as well. They've moved to more sites. And in fact, there has been, in a couple of years in there, a breeding attempt in England. So a remarkable increase when we really wouldn't predict this to have happened. And we don't really know why, but it gives me a chance to talk about this fascinating pattern, this amazing research on red-necked phalaropes using tiny GPS tags. So very lightweight tags which can be affixed to birds and allow their migration to be followed. These aren't satellite tags which transmit. So these are tags which require a bird to be caught again the following year and that tag removed and the data taken off it. But that's been used on red-necked phalaropes. And we see this map here of places within the range phalaropes have been tagged, including a few birds on Fetler, the best site for them in the UK, around the RSPB reserve on Fetler, and some birds have been tagged there, and produces quite outstanding, quite gobsmacking finding that birds breeding in northern Scotland are migrating down the east coast of North America, across the Caribbean, across Central America, and spending their winters in the Pacific. It's the only species we know to do this. So they're wintering around the Galapagos Islands, some birds probably down as far as the Peruvian coast. So this incredible migration that birds are doing. And it seems that the birds from Shetland are sharing the same migration pattern as those in Greenland and Iceland, whereas Scandinavian birds and those from further east into Siberia are migrating across land, wintering in the Red Sea, Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, and so forth. And there seems to be a divergence. We don't know that well how all of these populations are doing, particularly those further east, but it seems to be a divergence in those birds that are going the western route are doing well, for as much as we know that the Greenland and Icelandic populations of phalaropes are prospering, whereas those that are going cross land down to the Indian Ocean, all of those populations seem to be decreasing. So it may be something to do with wintering conditions that's driving changes in these populations. We know that our phalarope, and explains in fact some of the cycles that have been observed for many decades, the cycles in our small breeding population of redneck phalaropes seem actually possibly to be linked to the El Nino events, which I'm sure you'll be aware of, these huge cyclic current events in the South Pacific that affect the feeding conditions for all sorts of wildlife and the whole ecosystem there. And it seems our phalarope numbers may be fluctuating in response to that. So it's the wintering conditions on the other side of the planet which might be affecting our phalarope numbers and possibly being the cause for this recent increase. So we don't know that much, but there's fascinating things going on with phalaropes. A rather more sort of obvious conservation success, although really not a conventional conservation success, but the increase in goshawks. When the Rare Breeding Bird Panel started reporting in the early 70s, in 73, there were very, very few goshawks breeding in the UK. They just returning. At the time, it was thought that goshawks were returning due to possibly immigrant birds from the continent and accidental escapes of falconers birds. In retrospect, and more knowledge now, it seems, well, it's become apparent that there was nothing accidental. There was some very deliberate releases by falconers. So there was a sort of conservation effort, not like conventional conservation organisations. And before the likes of English Nature and RSPB got round to releasing red kites, and SNH got round to releasing white-tailed eagles, falconers did it for themselves in bringing goshawks back to the UK, a long extinct species. And we could see that once they came back, although they are still persecuted, you may have seen in the news recently the 5 goshawk corpses found dumped in the Brecks, Norfolk Brecks, but we could see this steady increase of the goshawk population, probably underreported now. Some goshawks are breeding in areas with little monitoring, so the population is up to about 800 pairs. There may well be 1,000 or more pairs, steadily increasing, spreading across southern England as well as in more northern and western areas nowadays. So goshawks really prospering. Now we can see, in fact, across all of the UK's countries, blue lines at the top trend. We can see the English population in grey, and the increase there being mirrored in Wales and Scotland at a slightly slower level, 1 or 2 pairs in Northern Ireland. I mentioned our upper limits, so 2,000 pairs is where a rare bird ends as far as the panel's concerned, and some species are very close to moving off that in response to their increases. We can see the population of Mediterranean gull here. Big fluctuations in this, though. So although in some years population has exceeded, got to about 2,400 pairs, in 2019, the Mediterranean gull populations. A large portion of the breeding population is down at Langston Harbour. I think in that peak year there were about 1,700 pairs in the one colony, and numbers there can fluctuate due to how high spring tides were during the breeding season or due to disturbance. So we're retaining the species on our list for the time being while we see this fluctuation, and of course having to keep a watching eye on some of these species because of the potential impacts of avian influenza. So if bird flu got into that big Mediterranean gull colony, like it has into some of the seabird colonies in Scotland, for example, on great skua populations, we could see a big drop there. So we're not going to take it off our list of species just yet. So there's a number of species which have been steadily increasing. I've got good news year after year mostly. Of course, it's not the case for everything. For example, redback shrike, by the time the panel started collecting data in 1973, it was already a very rare bird, having been once a common and widespread species across all of southern England. The panel monitored its decline to what looked like extinction at the time. When I was growing up as a young bird watcher in the 80s in North Buckinghamshire, part of our sort of annual spring birding trip to the East Anglia would involve going to see the last pair of redback shrikes in the country, breeding at Santon Downham in Norfolk until they disappeared. And that's the gap in 1989 on that graph when they disappeared, those red bars with the confirmed breeding pairs. And we thought it had gone, but redback shrikes, as I mentioned earlier, are sort of hanging on as a breeding species in the UK. There's been quite a few breeding records in Devon in recent years, quite a few in northern Scotland, so they still continue to occur. If we look across the channel to the Low Countries, there's been quite a resurgence. They've undergone the same pattern. For example, in the Netherlands, they were down to about 50 pairs by the turn of the century. They're now back up to about 500 pairs in the Netherlands. They've gone extinct in Flanders. They're now back with a healthy breeding population in Flanders. So there is potential for this species to return, although obviously, as well as climatic impacts, it's largely changes in our farming systems and the lack of large invertebrates that species like redback shrikes need to feed on that's hit it. Unless we do something about our farming and how our wider countryside is managed, there'll be very few places for redback shrikes to return to. And another sort of sad news story is Montagu's harriers. Our last report for 2020 was the first report since the 1970s, since the mid-1970s, not to have a confirmed record of breeding Montagu's harriers in the UK. And we know that there hasn't been a record since 2020 either. So there are a small number of individuals returning to former breeding areas still, but in recent years no pairs have been formed. Some of those individuals have been returning for a number of years and not finding mates. They may not continue to return. Satellite tracking of these birds has revealed that quite a few die on migration. Adverse weather events when they're crossing the Sahara and the like. So yeah, we're at risk of losing those few birds that are still returning and having very little chance of the species recovering. So very alarming for use harriers at the moment. There's a few other examples. So with big trends there, increasing species and some species doing very badly. Then there are a lot of species that just sort of wobble around, go up and down. I mentioned quail before and the range change. You can see here very quick graphically these quail years, these big invasion years where much larger numbers turn up. So 2011, where there were over 2,000 singing males in the country, whereas some years there are less than 200. Not really known what drives these. Not enough known about quail to know what drives these big peaks. Fascinatingly, one of the things about quails is that we know that some of the birds that turn up seeing an attempt to breed in the UK, usually in sort of late spring, often June before quail arrive and start singing in the UK, are offspring of pairs that have bred further south in Europe same year. So they can breed very early down in, say, Iberia or in northern Africa, and the young born in basically late winter early spring, and then subsequently migrate north and try and breed themselves the same year as they were born. And that's some of our males turning up, which is quite a remarkable thing. Other species that do lots of ups and downs are resident species, but being a small resident, a species that's very vulnerable to hard winters. So we can see although there's a long-term increase in bearded tip numbers, we can see these dramatic fluctuations in numbers. They can be quite badly hit by hard winters. So the winters around the turn of the decade 10 years ago, 29, 10, 2010, 11, those two winters were quite hard, and we can see how population was really knocked back. The most recent fluctuation, not so dramatic, it was after the Beast from the East event in, see if I can get my years right, early 2018, I think, which hit populations in the east of Europe more than east of UK more than anything. So although that doesn't look like a dramatic decline, that last dip, that involved things like the population in the Yare Valley, that's in the Broads east of Norwich, where so the RSPB Structural Spen Reserve is. There'd been a population of 60 pairs there the year before the Beast from the East. There were no pairs in the entire valley the year after, so we can see these knockbacks. And then, like I mentioned, talked about rosefinches and beaters before, but there's even more obscure species. Every year our reports hold strange things, birds that turn up and attempt to breed. This is one local to me. This is well, it's a black tern. What we thought was a black tern that has turned up on the Northumberland coast for 3 summers in a row. Spends the summer looking rather frustrated within an Arctic tern colony, flying around trying to persuade female Arctic terns to mate with it, presenting fish to them and generally annoying the Arctic terns. After 2 years of this bird turning up, one of our very clever local bird watchers had a closer look at it and realised actually it's an American black tern. It's the American race, which is not thoroughly lost, and for 3 years in a row now it has returned to Northumberland, trying to breed, but never going to have any success in doing so. There are a few of these. This is a ring-billed gull, which has returned to the same colony of common gulls in Perth and Kinross for about 13 years now. In a couple of those years, it has been successful in persuading a female common gull to breed with it. So we don't know whether it's been successful, but has tried to breed, and we get these oddities turning up and attempting to breed. Another example, in recent years, been a few records of these. This is a Scandinavian race of rock pipits, which is quite a common feature along the coasts of Northumberland here during the winter, but they're quite hard to recognise and identify. But when they molt into their breeding plumage, and this buffy, sometimes quite orangey wash across the breast makes them more obvious. And we've realised that on some years along the coast, as far north as Shetland, some of these birds are staying and trying to breed, usually in hybrid pairings with our native race. And some of the oddities we get are not so much odd species, but odd places and dramatic changes in distribution. I used to show this slide, in fact, just sort of 4 years ago, I would show this slide and comment this was taken on the Northumberland coast at the most northerly breeding spot for avocet in the UK. Avocet are now bred in northeast Scotland, north of Aberdeen, and they've bred in the Outer Hebrides. So these remarkable range expansions are going on in some species which we're picking up through our monitoring. So, showing you some results, I've probably given you the impression that we know how all our rare breeding bird species are doing. We have these wonderful trim graphs for everything, and everything is fantastic. But we don't. Largely through our dependence on volunteer observers, on the submission of records through people's recreational activities, we suffer gaps in our monitoring, particularly on species which are hard to find. Maybe some of them, you can see this list. This is a list of some of the species for which our monitoring is not particularly good. fine species like longing owls because they're nocturnal, or lesser spotted woodpeckers because they're really quite secretive and hard to find other than early in the breeding season. Some of these species, monitoring is not that good because birdwatchers don't tend to be that interested in them. Well, recently, it's been quite hard to get people interested in monitoring willow tits. Sow buntings are very exciting, but actually if you're a bird watcher in Devon, where sow buntings are reasonably common in some areas, they're not very exciting, and we struggle to get people to monitor them. And then the other big reason, and most of the species which are on our sort of our, put it a naughty list, but our less well monitored species, are those of North and West UK, where we have less bird watchers, so we have lower population, human population, we have fewer bird watchers, and they're in remote and hard to reach places. So birds of upland and montane areas, so forth. And you can see the divers here, and likes of greenshank and wimbrel, and widgeon and snow bunting. They're species of places where there aren't enough bird watchers to get good data. But actually, there are gaps in our reporting all over the place. So that's why we try and encourage people to do these talks and try and persuade people to help us with our work. And this goes for Berkshire as well. I'm sure, well, I know that not all the rare breeding birds, not every pair of rare breeding birds is found in Berkshire every year. So the chance that you can help the work of the panel by making sure that any observations of rare breeding birds you make reach us, or even better, going out of the way and trying to help us try to look for rare breeding birds. So this list is based on the last 5 years of data for Berkshire. These are the species for which we have records. Doesn't mean there might not be other species which have escaped notice in those 5 years, but gives you an idea of the rare breeding bird species in your area that we're interested in receiving records. So I'll leave that up. Well, in fact, I've got to come back to slide in a minute, so you can take that in and think, oh, right, okay, I've got to look for those. So I'm really looking for people to help our work. And a lot of this is just thinking, being aware of the rare breeding bird panel, being aware of the value of sightings that you make of these species during the spring and summer, which may relate to breeding behaviour and we want to know about. So if you see a little ringed plover in Berkshire during the breeding season, make sure that, oh yeah, that bloke I saw, that bloke who talked about, I can't remember his name, but he talked about rare breeding birds. Yeah, he might want to know about this. I'd better submit the record. So make quality records, I've got there. So it's very important that we get good data. So not vague, oh, I saw a little ringed plover somewhere. So we want records with dates on, with good numbers, with precise location details of where the observations were. Breeding evidence. So this is a concept you may be aware of from, say, atlases, contributing to breeding bird atlases where birds are categorized. Evidence and behavior you see of birds are categorized into these three classes: possible, probable, and confirmed breeding. So possible breeding can simply be birds in the right place at the right time of year. A gargany in May in a wetland is likely to be interested in breeding. You see a lesser spotted woodpecker in a woodland in Berkshire any time from about February onwards. It's very likely to be breeding in that wood, even if you don't see any further evidence of that. It is a bird in breeding habitat, and that is worth submitting to us. You see a bird singing. That's a sort of step further, better bit of evidence, but is still regarded as just possible breeding evidence. But then if you see, perhaps if you make repeat visits to a place, you've seen a lesser spotted woodpecker somewhere, you go back to look for it again, and you find it again. It's a bird staying there, there's a permanent territory. Or maybe you see that there is a pair there, or there's some of this behavior like looking at nest sites or nest building. These are what we allow us to classify a breeding attempt as probable breeding. And then confirmed breeding is any breeding attempt. This definition of confirmed breeding by a pair of birds is any breeding attempt which results in the laying of eggs. It doesn't have to be successful breeding to be called confirmed breeding. They don't have to raise young, but if birds go on to lay eggs, you consider that confirmed breeding. So there can be indications of fledged young, obviously. If they're recently fledged and have come from that site, that is evidence of confirmed breeding. But it might be other things like birds carrying food to a nest, finding a nest itself, finding eggshells, for example. So when you're observing rare breeding birds during the breeding season. We want this information. What did you see? Was there a nest? Did you see fledged young? So forth. This was one of my favourite photos. This is a species I did my PhD on many years ago, and it's incredibly rare. Most years there's only one breeding pair of purple sandpipers in the UK at a remote location in the Highlands, and this is a photo taken a few years ago of one of that pair roosting on the rock in the front ground, and the two young they produced that year in the background. So there you are, as a confirmed breeding record with young of purple sandpipers, and just I think a lovely photo. So we want you to be, when you're out bird watching in Berkshire, thinking of these and collecting this information, submitting it to Mark Walford, your county recorder. So I don't want people to send me data directly. Submit them to your county recorder, and it comes through our normal submission route to me. Of course, we want people to remember wildlife legislation and the Birdwatchers Code of Conduct when they're out. Rare breeding birds can be sensitive to disturbance, so thinking about those, making sure that any efforts you make to monitor and collect data on rare breeding birds don't cause any damage, any disturbance towards the birds themselves. And as an extension of that, thinking about how you share news about rare breeding birds, particularly nowadays with social media and the speed and ease of communication. Please be careful when if you've found something exciting, some interesting rare breeding bird in the breeding season, think about it before you put it on Facebook or Twitter or who you tell, because that can lead to disturbance. And fortunately, the threat of egg collection, while it still exists, is not as great as it used to be. It's certainly dying out. But unfortunately, the problems caused by disturbance by those keen to see rare breeding birds, or those keen to get photographs of rare breeding birds, is a sort of new and more modern threat to some of our sensitive species. So do think about how you share details. Think about if you might, there's some of the species on that list locally to you that you could make an extra effort, have an interest in. Go out looking for undiscovered pairs of little ringed plovers, for example. Example I use when I talk is a passion of mine, long-eared owls. Unfortunate enough, in Northumberland we have quite a decent population of long-eared owls. They're beautiful birds. They're quite hard to find, and they were very little studied. So until recently, an average year in Northumberland, there might be somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen pair of long-eared owls reported. When the COVID lockdown hit, I started cycling around in the evening in the lanes near where I live in Alnwick, looking for long-eared owl pairs, and just within that one spring in 2020, found 22 pairs of long-eared owls, 22 family parties of long-eared owls indeed, within a 10-kilometre radius of where I lived. So it's sort of big change in what we knew about long-eared owls in Northumberland, and just in the years since, it's become apparent that they're quite well distributed. There's quite a lot of them out there to be found, which we didn't realise before. So it's been great fun. You can see here this maps from the spare room wall. My wife's a teacher, so every time I went out and found a new pair of long-eared owls, I nicked one of her little merit stickers and bung it up on my map to show the increasing numbers. Yeah, and could be a species like that you could start studying. I don't think you've got that many long-eared owls in Berkshire, though there will be some, and possibly some unfound. So I'd encourage you, and they're wonderful things anyway, but I encourage you to sort of take an interest, do a bit more if you can. So there you are, that's that list again. Hobbies, often species that's undetected, hard to find, but if you look at the right time of the year, late in the summer, you might be able to find some new fledged broods of hobbies, spotted woodpeckers, frequently under-recorded species. Yeah, there are a few there that I'm sure there is stuff to learn about in Berkshire. The other thing to do is encourage you all to think about rare breeding birds when you're travelling. And I mentioned before, in particular, this gap in our reporting with poor coverage we have in North and West Britain. And of course, those are places where people like to go on birdwatching holidays, on holidays which involve a bit of birdwatching. They are wonderful places to go. And if you're one of those people, if you get the chance of a Scottish holiday, for example, please remember the rare breeding bird panel. Some of the wonderful habitats up there never get birdwatched, never get visited, and there are many species which could be under-recorded there. So the likes of greenshank, for example, we receive possibly as low as 10%, certainly not more than 20% of records of the breeding population. We know from the one survey that there was in the 1980s of greenshank, they're massively under-recorded. So if you're lucky enough to be on holiday in Scotland, and greenshank can be quite conspicuous, quite noisy, quite loud, displaying or alarm calling near nest sites, please remember that the rare breeding bird panel is interested in records of greenshank and get them submitted. If you're feeling athletic and energetic and you get up at tops of mountains and you're lucky enough to find something like a snow bunting, please make sure records, like I said before, good quality records with details of location and so forth are submitted. One way of doing that is, because it needs to go to the local bird recorder to reach us, is to use a system like BirdTrack. So the BTO run online reporting system, BirdTrack, allows data to be channeled to the correct bird recorder all across the UK. If you're like me, I use BirdTrack on the app that's on my phone. All the bird watching I do goes immediately in there. You can see all the little green markers on that map, places in Northumberland I've been bird watching. You can see quite a bit of bird watching. So I've been able to collect data, submit them in there, and they're all available to the Northumberland bird recorder for local bird reports for all purposes, but including the rare breeding bird data. So my rare breeding bird data goes into BirdTrack, it goes to the bird recorder, and then it comes back to me in his submission from the County of Northumberland. So it's an easy way to make your data available for the panel and for other purposes. So there you are. I hope you found that interesting. Hopefully you think what the RBBP does is worthwhile, and hopefully you will remember us in the spring and summer. Consider how you can help get those records submitted, and think about us when you're on holiday or other opportunities. There's the web address again if you want to find out more, our Twitter account if you're on Twitter and you want to follow us. The only other thing, and I have remembered to mention, is, as I said, we're 50 years old this year. As a consequence of that, we'll be doing various things to celebrate that. There will be an online rare breeding bird panel conference on the evenings of the 15th and 16th of March, about 2 hours long each evening with a break, with a variety of talks, short talks from experts on rare breeding birds from across the UK, all sorts of species, all sorts of uses of data. It should be a really interesting event, totally free. You'll need to go to our website to find out details, which will be going up there shortly. You'll need to pre-register so you've got the details for attending, and it won't be me talking for 2 hours. And there'll be lots of interesting species, so well worth considering. There'll also be new papers about our work in both British birds and British wildlife. We've got a number of new features to go up on our website, including sort of fact pages on all of the UK's rare breeding bird species. It'll become a greater resource. There'll be magazine articles, there'll be press releases and so forth. So all sorts of activity. Hopefully some of this will tickle your fancy and you'll be able to join us in celebrating our birthday. And we're going to run out of time for any questions, so I shall stop talking and thank you for your time in listening to me. And I shall get rid of my screen.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. That was absolutely fascinating. We have a few minutes left for questions. So let me put you back. Just change the view. Oh, I can't find. No, I won't. Can't find the. Anybody in the room or on Zoom got a question they'd like to ask Mark in the few minutes we have remaining? We've got a hand up here.
Yeah. Is there any evidence about the bustards on Salisbury?
You may not have heard that on Zoom. Is there any evidence about the bustards breeding on Salisbury Plains?
So we received data from the busted group that lead the project there. The population does seem to be increasing quite rapidly in recent years. I think they've now, I may be wrong, but I think they've now stopped with the release program. there are no new birds going out, and the population does seem to be going quite well. It's still not considered a sort of self-sustaining population. The BOU would have to make a decision to say that yes, it's now a population which is sort of self-sustaining and truly wild, but it does seem to be going in the right direction, so that's good to know.
Okay. Any other questions from here, or right, another one from the back?
You mentioned a publication during the talk. Was it the European Breeding Bird Atlas?
You may not have heard, Mark. It asked if the publication you mentioned was the European Breeding Bird Atlas, the one you were advertising earlier.
That's right. Thank you for asking again, whoever that was, and giving me another opportunity. Very well done. Yes, it's the European Breeding Bird Atlas 2. Was published late in 2019 by Lynx Editions, a Spanish publisher, and is produced by the European Bird Census Council. If you search for the European Bird Census Council, you'll find our website and details about it on there. And in fact, although it would be great if people could buy a copy, if you go online and find our website, all of the maps from the book are now available free online. There is a website with all of the new maps available, so they're worth looking at.
Well, I think we're getting short of time. I've got one question I'd like to ask. You're making me realise that we encourage people to submit records, but I don't think as a bird club, Neil might correct me on this, I don't know if we've ever encouraged people particularly to focus on the list of rare breeding birds that you put up for the county, and I'm wondering whether we should be publicising that to members. You've obviously reached a few people here today, but quite a few people, but we could be, for instance, publishing through the newsletter saying these are the ones we should be focusing on and this is the kind of records they need.
I think you're right. I think we've actually had a specific campaign focusing on the rare breeding bird panel species. I know sadly about 10 years ago we didn't have a very good record at forwarding them on, but unfortunately the last two recorders have pulled our socks up, and I think we're now quite good at it. But I think it would be a good idea perhaps to publish Mark's list and get on our website. As well, too.
You may not have heard that, Mark, but the general idea is we should be publishing your list on our website and through and publicising it otherwise to our members. So if we went on the list, I was just going to offer, if
you want me to write something for a newsletter or a website, if you want a few words to promote it, I'd be more than happy to jot something down for you, if that would help.
Brilliant. That was exactly what I was going to ask next. So thank you very much.
Okay, there you are.
That's what I like to hear. Thank you very much, Mark. Yes, please. Is the easy answer there. Right. I think we, unless there's any other. I noticed somebody put something in chat. Was that a question, Elaine, or is that
just a fascinating talk? Thank you.
All right, a fascinating talk. Comments from the audience. Unless there's anything else anybody would like to raise, I think we'll need to wrap up now. The caretakers here aren't as sharp as they used to be, but I'm very conscious that we're getting close to 10 o'clock. So I'd just like to say a very big thank you to Mark for that talk. I certainly found it illuminating and fascinating, and I'm embarrassed to say that I've never even thought on holiday of reporting birds, which is appalling, I have to say. I'm going to pull my socks up. So thank you very much indeed, Mark, and
absolute pleasure.
Show our appreciation in a normal way.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you.
I'll just finish with a brief reminder. Our next meeting 2 weeks' time is here, endangered birds in Mauritius, and please remember to put your photos into the photo competition. It's a wonderful evening, but it obviously relies on lots of people sending in really the usual really good photos. So thank you very much and good night.